all you see is fire.
Let me ask you a question. Can a show exist with no identity? And if you take away a core part of the essence of a show, is it still the same show you once loved? How much of a show can be changed before it's no longer what it originally was? And to a larger point, what do you do when the show itself realizes that it's time for it to be put out of its misery? Well, that's what I'm going to try and figure out today. Hello everyone, and welcome to The Void Theater. As always, I'm your host Alexander, and I can now formally check Give the Audience an Existential Crisis off the list of things to do for my channel. But that title in the intro might seem a little dramatic, but I think there's some truth to it. Because Family Guy is a show that's been running for longer than some of the people watching this have been alive. It's a show that's existed through multiple generations of presidents, has seen multiple generations come and go, and yet despite the odds, it's kept on trucking even when it seemed like it shouldn't. It's a show that's gone from cream of the crop to arguably one of the most hated cartoons that's ever existed in the adult animation circuit. And it's obvious why. No show can last as long as Family Guy has without losing their way at some point. And most people seem to agree that the show should just be put out of its misery at this point. Now, shocking absolutely no one, I'm also in this group of firm believers that Family Guy should have ended years ago. Though, to be fair, I'm also in the same belief that Rick and Morty should end soon, so take what you will from that. But what if I told you that the show itself recognizes what it used to be and talked about wanting to go back to what it once was? Well, that's what I want to prove in this video. So, without any further ado, let's put this episode on stage and see how it plays out. So, first things first, let's actually address two very specific things. The episode in question, and the fact that Family Guy has often worn its heart and its opinion on its sleeve. Whether that be about current politics, entertainment, or more recently the show itself, the fact is that Family Guy has never been shy about voicing its opinion on whatever it felt it could. Now I want you to hold on to that because it's a theme that will repeat a lot throughout the video. And two is that Family Guy has a crippling self-esteem issue, or at least the modern version of Family Guy does. It's something you'll notice the more you watch it. The show has an almost obsessive drive to mention how it's never won an Emmy. It's something that only becomes more frequent as the show goes on, with one episode essentially being the show begging to win one. Now again, this may seem like filler, but just keep these themes in mind as the video goes on, because it's all going to click together later. But to get to the actual episode at hand, today we'll be talking about Season 20's 4th episode, 80s Guy. Now if you don't remember this episode, well, that's no fault of your own. As it stands, the episode is largely forgettable with the simple plot. Peter tries to recreate all the best parts of the 80s movies to prove they're still classics after Chris gets arrested for mimicking them. And normally, I would go over the entire episode and maybe cover the B-plot, but honestly, I just gave you all the info you need on this episode. And while I am dragging this episode through the mud for its simple plot, it does hold some deeper meanings in the context. Because on the surface, the episode seems to be nothing more than Peter calling back to the supposed grandeur of the 80s, underneath the surface, it starts to feel like the staff writing the episode are telling the audience that it has to let go of the idea of what Family Guy was, and more importantly, it's telling itself that it has to learn how to be its own type of Family Guy. And that's actually the best place to start because it's also the beginning of the episode, with Chris trying to impress a girl and Peter telling him that the best way to do that is by recreating the scenes out of his favorite decade of films, the 80s. Now again, it's no surprise that Family Guy has an extremely high opinion of the 80s. The show itself originally debuted in 1999, so it makes sense that at the time, the writers would have a nostalgic view of 80s culture. It would have been a time when most of them were growing up, so it makes sense that the writers would see them as instant classics. Again, the plot here isn't what this video is about. It's about the tones and the themes that follow. So after Chris is arrested for copying the 80s movies because, shocker, a decent chunk of those movies are insanely creepy by today's standards, Peter says that he's going to set out to prove that the 80s are still a classic as they originally were. And that's one of the things I want to focus on. That line right there about how 80s humor will always be classic. Family Guy is an old show that's styled after the 80s and 90s. The entire crux of the show has always been tied to that theme. But the other side to that is because of those ties to that style of humor, Family Guy has also run into its fair share of controversy for how they handle certain topics. Now, remember what I said about the writers of Family Guy wearing their heart on their sleeves? Take that thought and apply it to what Peter just said, and you'll notice it starts to sound like a writer who wants the audience to shut up about how they've fallen off and rely too much on a type of humor that's been dead for 20 plus years. In fact, they actually have another character playing the role of the audience for the entirety of the episode in Lois. Every time Peter tries to replicate the 80s or find a new decade to copy the jokes from, it's Lois who steps in and tells him to stop it, and that his over-reliance on decades-old humor has worn out its welcome.
Be a husband to your wife. Be a father to your children.
And it's pretty apparent that Lois is meant to be the audience in this scenario. The way she talks and acts is in line with her as a character, but her complaints are the same ones that fans have said for years at this point. She talks about how instead of Peter constantly trying to remake those dated references, he can instead try to be a good husband and father, or just do anything else that doesn't constantly rely on these jokes. And the thing is, those complaints she listed, they're things that Peter used to be. He did used to be a loving father to all his kids. Even Meg had some decent moments where Peter would stand up for her and remind her how much she means to him. And before Chris was reduced to what he is now, Peter actually supported his dream of being an artist. All these things used to exist in the show along with the humor you see, but it was blended in a way that didn't oversaturate each other. But over time, one took over and left the other to die out. But the episode ends with Peter getting ready to kill himself and being talked out of it by an 80s director who tells him to stop living in that time and to go out and create his own new moments. Which leads to the episode ending with pretty much nothing changing. Alright, so let's talk about this because this episode, if it wasn't already obvious, is clearly a writer using the characters as stand-ins for their own feelings. Nearly everything that both Peter and Lois argue about over the course of the episode are just the same fights that the fanbase has been arguing about since Family Guy started to go downhill. These are all the same issues that have been repeated ad nauseum. However, what's different is that there's no counter argument to these. In every instance when Lois brings up these issues, you'll notice that Peter never directly addresses the issues. The first time, he simply disagrees with her, and the second time, he outright ignores what she's saying. So it's less an argument between the writers and the audience, and more the writers acknowledging the show's current shortcomings. And it does this a lot. Remember what I said about the issues Family Guy has with Emmys? Well, this leads right back to that concept, because at the core of the episode Emmy Guy is the same recurring theme that exists in 80s Guy. That being that at their core, they're episodes that are at the very least one writer's way of acknowledging Family Guy's downfall and seemingly hoping to have the show cancelled. And they all follow this weird theme of constantly comparing the show to what it was or how it used to be. It's like what Teen Titans Go does, except instead of doing it in a sincere way, it just comes off as angry and malicious. Every time they make jokes like this, it just feels like we're looking at a writer trapped in a dead-end show, hoping for it to end. And considering Family Guy's been cancelled multiple times at this point, I can't say I don't understand where they're coming from. Remember that question I asked at the beginning of this video about whether or not a show can exist with no identity, or how much of a show's core can be changed before it's no longer what it originally was? Well, Family Guy is essentially living through that question in real time. Even that joke about not winning any Emmys only makes sense when you realize that it's talking about its current iteration of Family Guy. Because in its heyday, the show won numerous Emmy awards, but now that its parts have been taken from it piece by piece with each cancellation, you're left with, well, just this. A hollow shell living off the former memory of what it once was, and a group of writers who are aware of what the show was and the awards and accolades it used to get, who want to recapture the greatness that the show once had, but have also come to realize that the show's time in the sun is set, so instead they just take pot shots at the show itself. You know, now that I think about it, this is essentially a reverse SpongeBob scenario. In the video I did on that, I mentioned a prevailing theory going around on the internet that SpongeBob was currently being written by writers who idolized what the show was as children. So in an attempt to recreate what they saw as kids, they just ended up using the memories of what they enjoyed. The result, as most people know, is the current run of the show, where things feel like SpongeBob, but just twisted up. Here, it's like someone loved what Family Guy was, tried to recreate it, failed, and now just spends the rest of their time constantly bashing it again and again. It'd be funny if it wasn't so consistently aggressive. It's like that Simpsons couch gag where they go so far into the future that they become single trait characters of what they once were, just in real time for everyone to watch. So now all we're left with is a show desperately trying to be what it remembers it was before the memory fades away. A pale, bland imitation of something that was once beloved. But with that dreary little note, we close the curtain on this video of Family Guy. I know this wasn't what I had up next, but I had this idea after I saw a video on, ironically enough, that very same Simpsons couch gag that had this similar theme, which I'll leave a link down below for you to check out because it's just outstanding. But as always, with the current closing, I'll leave you with some questions. Should Family Guy continue to produce episodes or just end? And what other shows need to reach a finale before they end up in the same boat? I look forward to your answers, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content. Until next time, I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.